We believe in the startups, the mom and pops, the underdogs, where desks may be optional, but deadlines are inevitable. You put everything you've got into the one thing you love. So for that, we'll be there with communication solutions designed to keep you moving forward, because you are the next big thing. We believe in the startups, the mom and pops, the underdogs, where desks may be optional, but deadlines are inevitable. You put everything you've got into the one thing you love. So for that, we'll be there with communication solutions designed to keep you moving forward, because you are the next big thing.
Good morning and welcome to Federal Focus. I'm Justin Grainer, the Vice President of Public Policy for the Chattanooga Chamber. We are excited to have you here today to talk directly with policymakers and influencers from Washington, D.C. to talk about the issues that are facing Southeast Tennessee and the business community. 2020 was a very challenging year on a whole lot of fronts, from healthcare to the economy to businesses just trying to stay afloat. Now into workforce. How do we find the people that we need to keep our businesses going? We're going to have those conversations today. We couldn't do this without our great group of sponsors. EPB, our presenting sponsor. Our platinum sponsors, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee and Sandler Training. And our gold sponsors, the Chattanooga Airport, Food City, Chambliss, Lattimore, Black, Morgan, and Kane, Pinnacle, the Sasha Group, Truist Bank, Unum, and Volkswagen are key partners in providing today's content. So let's get started. First up, we have Neil Bradley, the Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer from the U.S. Chamber.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for our Federal Focus event. My name is Christy Gillenwater, and it is my pleasure to host our first session today of our Federal Focus event. And joining me is Neil Bradley, a dear friend of the Chattanooga Chamber and numerous chambers throughout the country. So Neil serves as Executive Vice President, Chief Policy Officer, and Head of Strategic Advocacy at the United States Chamber of Commerce. Neil is responsible for the organization's overall advocacy efforts. In addition to managing policy development for the U.S. Chamber, Neil oversees its government affairs activities, political program, and relations with the business organizations, other business organizations. And prior to joining the Chamber, Neil spent nearly 20 years working in the House of Representatives, including 11 years working for the House Republican leadership. He served as Deputy Chief of Staff for then Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, where he developed the legislative agenda for House Republicans. He oversaw policy formulation in the leader's office and coordinated committee activities in the House. Neil held the same position for Eric Cantor during his tenure as Majority Leader. And before that, he was Policy Director for House Republican Whip Roy Blunt. Now, we know Neil well. He's often addressed the Chamber CEO Roundtable and is always quick to respond and has been such a key voice and advocate for the business community, particularly on the federal level. So Neil, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Christy. Good morning. It's great to see you and great to be with everyone.
All right. Well, we have some interesting questions for you today. And first of all, we think a lot of businesses out there don't really understand necessarily the policy process that the U.S. Chamber embarks on, when thinking about different positions that you might take. So if you could enlighten us on your process to start.
Absolutely. So, we're 112 years or so old right now, and we have certain kind of fundamental truths and principles, like I know you all do at the Chattanooga Chamber. I mean, we believe in the value of free enterprise. We believe in market competition. We believe in a regulatory state and a government state and public policy that encourages entrepreneurialism. And lets people come up with a good idea and take it to the market and see if they can get anyone to buy in. And so that undergirds everything that we do, that fundamental belief in free enterprise. When we tackle specific policy questions, we obviously always look to how they match those fundamental principles. And then in addition, we work through with our members. And so we have several dozen committees at the U.S. Chamber that inform our work in different issue areas. Internally, those committees are led by issue experts, in many cases who have decades of experience in the area, and they're working with business leaders who have a particular interest in that area or care about it to help us formulate our policies.
Thank you for that. And I know I've had the pleasure of getting to know several of your experts, and they really are fantastic. And they work really closely as well with local chambers. There's a U.S. Chamber Committee of 100, and many local chamber leaders serve on that. We always appreciate, that partnership as well, and your willingness to really hear from the front lines. It's
a great example of one of our committees because we learned so much from chambers across the country, state chambers, metro chambers, local chambers, from everything from folks who are in heavy tourism locations where that really drives the local economy to people who are in manufacturing or agriculture, and those viewpoints kind of filtering in, it just makes it so much easier to do our job. And I hope and I believe it makes it better.
Absolutely. And I think it helps to inform us and bring those key messages, back to our local communities as well. So thank you for that. So one key topic that I know I've heard you speak about at length, and of course the U.S. Chamber and something many chambers are focused in on in businesses, is the bipartisan infrastructure package, right? And the Chamber's really been a key leader on that. So question, it's been talked about for a long time. It feels like like decades, right? Talk to us about the framework, what's in the bill, and what you think the likelihood of success might be in both the House and Senate.
Well, when you say decades, you're exactly right. I stole this line from someone, but they said infrastructure is the best, most popular idea that just never seems to get done. And my goodness, for those of you who grew up with Peanuts and Lucy and the Football, it really feels like Lucy and the Football moments here. I do have hope that this time is different, that we're going to put the football through the uprights on this occasion, in part because I think it's been approached a little bit differently. For too long, an issue that really should be bipartisan and traditionally has been when done successfully, became a little bit polarized, and both sides were kind of looking for advantage. And there was a real risk at the beginning of this year, new administration, new Congress, that we were going to go down that same path. One of the things that we were proud to work on with state and local chambers was a coalition that we formed. We called it Build by the 4th of July. And we purposefully went out and we invited labor to join in the coalition. And then we invited environmental groups. And we said from the outset that there's a lot of specifics we're not going to agree on, but we all agree we need to get something done, and failure shouldn't be an option. And if we can demonstrate that we can work together, maybe our lawmakers can do the same. So I don't want to take credit for that for the chamber, but I do think credit belongs to everyone on kind of all sides of this issue who are willing to step forward and really push in that way. And so now we have this package endorsed by 22 senators, 11 Republicans, 11 Democrats, supported by the Biden administration, and now endorsed by a group called the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House, which is 29 Republicans and 29 Democrats. And so we definitely have momentum. Yesterday or day before yesterday, I think it was 360 mayors from across the country, Republicans, independents, nonpartisans, all endorsed this package. The framework's about $1.2 trillion. That's inclusive of continuing ongoing spending, our current highway programs, for example, and water programs, but also expanding those out. So, new investment is something close to $600 billion. A lot of that will focus on broadband and improving the electrical grid. But, in addition, replacing lead pipes. We're America. You shouldn't be poisoned by turning on your tap water. Yet in significant parts of the country, you are, because of outdated lead pipes. We can fix that. This makes the money available to do just that. I think we'll have a signing ceremony. I don't know if we'll get there before football season starts, but we'll get there before we know who's going to be in the playoffs for the football championship.
Well, that's so exciting to hear. And, it's something we've needed for so long. And so your leadership, and I'm relieved to hear your positive perspective on the outcome. And I think you bring up a great point, Neil, that, infrastructure is not just the roads and bridges, right? It's what you see, what we don't see that's underground. I know our former board chair was with American Water, and always tried to gently remind others as well around the importance of water, et cetera. And you're right, sometimes until you have a crisis in that area, you don't think about the importance of those pipes, et cetera, and broadband.
Well, think of what happens to small businesses. If you're a restaurant and you don't have running water, you're not operating, you're shutting down. And that's true for a lot of other businesses as well. And so this really is, it isn't just a good government, good society issue. We fundamentally need this infrastructure for businesses to be able to operate.
Yes, absolutely. Key issue for businesses, for sure. Well, good. Thank you for your leadership in it. Again, can't understate how, or overstate in this case, the importance of the U.S. Chamber's role in this space. So thank you and your particular leadership. So moving on, I know I've been impressed with some of the sessions the U.S. Chamber has held with intentionality around bipartisanship and really trying to bring back more of that, sane center model of governing. You've been intentional around bringing a Republican and a Democrat and featuring them on big issues like infrastructure and gaining perspective from both sides and their plans to work together. How might we continue to further that, and what role will the U.S. Chamber continue to play in that space?
Well, Christy, you're kind to notice, and thank you so much. I mean, I think, like most Americans, we're frustrated by the polarization and the gridlock that the polarization has produced. We have lots of problems, and we just talked about infrastructure in 2 decades. How much better of a position would we be economically if we'd have gotten this done a decade ago? And think about all the other issues, whether it's workforce or whether it's the rules of the road for a digital economy, which are right now being written for the world in Europe rather than the United States, because we just can't seem to get our act together. There are consequences and costs to this gridlock. That doesn't mean that Republicans and Democrats shouldn't come with firmly held beliefs and positions. We want them to do that. That's why we vote for people and why we elect them. But we also expect that they can find time and have a willingness to sit down and talk across the aisle about where common ground can exist and where they can figure out how to form a reasonable compromise that maybe achieves 80% of the goal, rather than settling for trying for 100% and end up getting nothing. And so we have hosted, we will continue to host Republicans and Democrats together to talk about particular issues, to find out where the differences are, although that's usually pretty easy to get to, but then to dig down a little deeper and say, well, you all seem to kind of agree on this. Why couldn't we at least focus on that and try to get that aspect of it done? And so our belief at the Chamber is that if you're frustrated by something, if you're bothered by something, if you think it's detrimental to your business, then you ought to figure out something to try to do about it. And so our actions over the last couple of years have really been let's not just settle that this is the way it has to be. Let's try to change it.
Well, bravo to you. And I think that's something we hear often locally from the business community is that need to create that safe space to have these hard discussions and figure out solutions. And that's what they expect from us. So you're leading in that space. Good. All right. So moving on, I know talent and workforce is top of minds. I know, we recently re-engaged some of our leadership around our strategic plan and heard loud and clear again that talent is everything in terms of our local and existing enterprises, but also those we're trying to lure here. So can you talk to us, Neil, a little bit around, the Chamber's Operation Warp Speed for Jobs and how that effort can help our businesses locally identify and work with those potential employees here?
Yeah, politicians throw around the word crisis kind of when it's convenient. We try not to do that at the U.S. Chamber. But this is one where we've actually labeled it a crisis. We call it a worker shortage crisis. It is not new. If you go back pre-pandemic, employers, our members were telling us that the number one issue was the difficulty they had in filling open jobs with skilled individuals. The pandemic exacerbated that problem, and it's even worse today. When we look at the number of job openings and the number of people in a perfect world that are available to fill them, it's 1-to-1. So 9.3 million job openings, just over that, the number of individuals who are available for work, who say they're available for work. But that assumes they live where the work is, that they have the skills for the jobs that are open, and we can make that match. And of course, we know that that's not a perfect system. So we've launched this Operation Warp Speed for Jobs. There's no singular cause to the worker shortage crisis. So therefore, there's no singular answer. There's a lot of different things that we need to do. For example, in the last couple of months, we've been focused on right-sizing unemployment benefits so that there's not a disincentive to work, phasing out, getting rid of the $300 supplement, working with states on return to work bonuses to help with individuals with there are incremental costs for returning to work. And if that's a barrier, it's in all of our interest to help address that and get people in. We know that childcare, access to affordable childcare, has been a barrier for a lot of working age parents. We can take steps to help address that. Skills has been a perennial problem. We think that this isn't just about throwing money at an issue. It's about getting the right skills training. If you want the right skills training, the best people to ask are the people who are hiring, who can tell you the skills that they need. So thinking about talent and sourcing talent in the same way that companies source material, if you will, being smart about it and figuring out, okay, who's the local community college who can help train to get the skills that I need? How do I convey those skills to them? How do I help them? How do I help get people into those programs? So that's part of our effort. Immigration has to be part of the solution as well. Immigrants have contributed to economic growth and job creation. They fill a lot of jobs in particularly key industries. And we need legal immigration that kind of meets our economy's demands. That rising tide is going to kind of lift all boats. And so we're working on all of those things as kind of part of this Operation Warp Speed to address the worker shortage crisis. And I'll say if we fail as a country in this, the result is going to be a stagnant economy. We're not going to achieve the growth that we should achieve. And that's not good for any of us.
I think that's a good point. I think we see it as catastrophic, if we fail in this area. And definitely it's a pain point here, and appreciate what you all are doing to lead in this space. I know we also are, to your point, it needs to be addressed at the federal level, state, local, and we have launched, December will be a year, ChattanoogaCalling.com, and we have nearly 12,000 jobs posted on that site, and also trying to create those clear pathways for individuals who are interested in furthering their education and better positioning themselves for some of these opportunities. And so you're right, meeting people where they are and trying to address those issues like childcare, et cetera. It's necessary, and again, applaud the U.S. Chamber for your leadership in that space. Thank you. So moving on, diversity, equity, and inclusion has been a key, part of our national dialogue here over the past year, and is a critical issue as it relates to talent and workforce. And it's something we hear a lot, again, from our employers, challenges and opportunities around, attracting and retaining diverse talent. Your colleague, Rick Wade, recently addressed our Diversify Summit. He was our keynote speaker. So you might talk to us a little bit more about the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion work and the role the U.S. Chamber is playing in that space.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having Rick. This is really important work, and we're proud to be a part of it. We're proud to be able to partner with chambers like Chattanooga Chamber to promote it. The evidence is really clear that diverse workplaces that access talent from a wide range of individuals with differing backgrounds improves the performance of business and ultimately improves the performance of local and overall economies. And so, the outcome, the goal really is in little doubt. The difficulty is figuring out how to achieve the diversity that we think is both the right thing to do, but also sustains the growth and takes advantage of the opportunities that are there for business and communities. And, that's historically been the challenge, and that's what the work that we're focused on is about. How do you, if you're a business, how do you recruit in a more diverse fashion? If you think about if you have a board, how do you recruit for board membership in a way that reflects the diversity of your community? If you think about your supply chain, how do you achieve diversity kind of in that supply chain? in the same way that we talked about bipartisanship a minute ago, you do have to be intentional about it, and you do have to think through strategies. So that's where we've been focused. In the same way that there are barriers for people returning to work, there are barriers that exist in kind of achieving the diversity levels that we want to achieve. And we just have to be cognizant of those and figure out how we address those barriers, whether they're in education, employment background, access to networks. All of these things can be barriers, but they're all things that can be overcome.
Well, and I think your word around intentionality, that is so critically important. And that's great. And again, appreciate the resources that y'all are providing for businesses, the toolkit, all of those things are just extremely valuable for those of us and local communities throughout the United States. So thank you. So next up, in the wake of COVID and the ensuing economic fallout, the federal government has spent a significant amount of money, as we know, in the past 16 months. While spending was needed in the aftermath of the pandemic, how does the sudden increase in spending impact business in the short term and the long term from a tax perspective, inflation perspective? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's you're exactly right, Chrissy. We did have to. We were in a once in a century pandemic through no fault of anyone who's tuning in this morning, and the government was right to respond. In fact, you want a government who has the fiscal capacity to be able to respond to emergencies, whether that's a war or a pandemic or a great recession. We need that capacity. The problem, as we look at it, is what the government is borrowing and spending during periods where we're not in a pandemic and where we're not in a great recession. And, I point to the fact that if you go back to January of 2020, most of us had never even heard of COVID at that point. The government, the federal, and by the way, we were in a hot economy, great economic growth, generational low unemployment, and the federal government was on track to run $1 trillion deficit in the best of economic times. That's what we can't afford to do. Those are the kind of pressures that long-term create costs for taxpayers and limit our capacity to respond when there actually is a real crisis. There are lessons for that as we think about the policies that are being debated in Washington today. Probably the last COVID relief package, it was a little generous in the total level and it wasn't well targeted. That's creating some of the inflationary pressures today. We will work through those quickly unless the federal government decides to double down. And this concept of $3.5, $4 trillion, some people are talking about a $6 trillion spending package that would tax investment in the future in order to fund consumption today. That's the recipe for 70s and 80s style inflationary levels. And it's the kind of fiscal decision that digs us way into a hole that we may not be able to climb out from. So, we did what had to be done now. Now we have to be smart about the decisions that policymakers make, and we can't go down this path of borrowing to fund current day consumption at record levels or taxing investment in the future to fund consumption.
Well, it's good to hear your perspective on it. I know it's something we hear from our small businesses as well as our large businesses, and in terms of some of the inflationary pressures and what they're seeing in some of their supply chain costs, et cetera. So it's something that we're definitely feeling here, and I know everyone is these days. So thank you for your thoughts on that issue. Next, another issue facing the Biden administration and Congress is the need to raise the debt ceiling. Do you foresee any problems addressing this? And again, tied to what we were just discussing, what are your thoughts there?
I hope not. A fact of life is the amount of money that had to be borrowed because of COVID, and that we have yet to make the fiscal decisions that we need to get the underlying house in order, as we just discussed. The debt limit is the symptom of that. It's not the cause of it. The money has been spent, and now we're dealing with a statutory limit on the debt. The problem with that statutory limit is if you don't increase it, you default on the debt. And the U.S. has, in our 200 and nearly 25-year history, we've never, 250 years, defaulted on the full faith and credit of the United States government, which is really the full faith and credit, of the American people. And so there would be disastrous consequences economically if we did that. So we're encouraging lawmakers, let's have a real discussion about spending and debt, but let's not play games with the full faith and credit of the United States that, if you get it wrong, could take the position that we're in poised for real growth and really turn it into an economic calamity.
Yes, well stated. Absolutely. Well, thank you. Final question, Neil, and be curious, just overarching comments you want to make on behalf of the U.S. Chamber after this question, but very important question. If you could give us a book, a suggested, title for our members, one of your favorites, maybe something that you think would jog some thoughts in terms of where we are today, what would that suggested book be?
If you'll permit me, I'm going to give you two, and they're very different books. This moment that we're in of polarization, the divide that we have in the country, one of the things that I've spent time trying to understand it from both visiting with people and understanding their perspective, but also understanding a little bit of the psychology behind it, how these things evolve. There's a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind, which really does a very nice job of encapsulating how people form viewpoints, including very passionately held viewpoints, and how engaging with them, there are productive ways to engage, and there are also ways to engage that completely reinforce someone's prior opinions, and you don't make progress. And I think we're at a moment in time where those are important things to understand and skills to have. The second book is completely different, and it's just a personal interest in both history and leadership. And I'm a big fan of Winston Churchill, and obviously what he did to save Western civilization in World War II. But there's a great book called Troublesome Young Men that's actually about the backbenchers in Parliament who helped remove Chamberlain from office, who was the prime minister before, and put Churchill into power. And interestingly, how some of these troublesome young men were real enemies at the time, politically and personally. And they overcame that for what they saw as the good of the leadership of their nation. And they did it in a way that in many cases actually didn't end up personally rewarding for them. In some instances, it cost them. And we remember Churchill today, but we often don't think about those people who were behind the scenes, who risked a lot to make all of that happen.
That's a great point. You think about teams and you think about all the people that go into building those teams and making them successful. And even to your point, that leadership of Winston Churchill and how many people it took for him to be in that position. And then once he was there to be successful, all the individuals who enabled and supported him in that success. So great point, great way to help us start to wrap up here. So Neil, final question, any parting thoughts you'd like to leave our membership with here in the Chattanooga region, representing the business community today?
Well, more than anything, I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you for what you're doing, both in your businesses to lead and to create jobs and create prosperity. That has ripple effects. It doesn't just affect Chattanooga and the region there, or Tennessee. It ripples out to the entire country, as does your leadership. Business leaders have an important voice in our nation, in the public policy debates, and the work that you do to amplify that voice and to join with others is just really important. Like in business, success isn't a given and doesn't just happen. And so people have to put the work into it. I'm just so grateful that we have partners who are putting the work into it. I am an optimistic person by nature. And when I look at what we're kind of poised for the future, the great untold story out of the last year, record number of new business starts in the United States. We don't even really understand why, but across the country, tens of thousands, several 100,000 people woke up and said, I have an idea and I'm going to start a business. And they're already hiring people. And when you think about what those businesses are going to become, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, I bet a couple of them are going to be in the Fortune 500 within the decade. Like, that's what makes America great. That's what makes it prosperous. And it's all because of the free enterprise system and the work that goes on in local communities, at the state and the federal level to make it possible. And I'm just grateful for your partnership.
Neil, that's a perfect way to end. I know we're so bullish about representing the business community and those small businesses. To your point, I mean, the risk that's involved, the passion that's involved, the sleepless nights, saying thank you to individual businesses constantly is so important, because the days are long and often difficult, but the reward can be so tremendous. And thank you so much for joining us today, everyone, all of our leaders. And thank you so much to Neil Bradley with the U.S. Chamber for this most interesting discussion. Again, I think very pertinent for the business community. And we can't thank you enough for your continued leadership and stewardship of the advocating for the business community at the federal level. So thank you so much, Neil, and thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Neil. And Christy, appreciate your work. Next up, we have a conversation with Senator Marsha Blackburn.
United States Senator Marsha Blackburn is the first woman to serve in the United States Senate from the state of Tennessee. She's also a member of the Armed Services Committee, the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, as well as Veteran Affairs, Judiciary, and is a ranking member on Consumer Protection, Public Product Safety, and Data Security Subcommittee. Senator Blackburn, welcome to the Chattanooga Chamber Federal Focus, and sounds like you're pretty busy in DC.
We are busy indeed, and trying to get a few things done here, and of course paying a lot of attention to what all is going on in the state, talking with our local elected officials, talking with a lot of chambers, and looking at the economic health of our state. I think we're very pleased to learn that during the year of COVID, Tennessee was one of only 6 states in the country that ended up with the budget surplus. And we have been very pleased to see the economic health of our counties, tax revenues being up, money coming into those counties.
Yeah. But last year was definitely a year that many of us won't forget. And speaking of that, could you touch a little bit on just being a legislator in DC during the pandemic, just how that impacted you personally and how you see the country from this moment?
What we did was to just find a new way to continue our contact with Tennesseans. Every year I have visited with each of our counties, either virtually or in person, to make certain that we are meeting the needs of local communities. And during COVID, we did that. Of course, after the pandemic hit, all of our meetings had to be virtually. We're just now getting to the point that we can get back out and actually visit with counties, and are really looking forward to that. Likewise, we're like so many agencies, entities, organizations, and companies that had to find a way to allow remote work. And we were able to do this. for our staff that is both in DC and in the state. And then as Tennessee opened up probably a little bit more quickly than some other states, what we were able to do was turn our attention to have more of our staff members in the state, because they were actually able to do in-person meetings and work with Tennesseans.
And touching on that, just as everybody had to go home, last year really showed our reliance on technology, and really the ones that have and the folks that don't have. Could you touch a little bit about your thoughts on where broadband is going to go and just some of the technologies for people that need basic internet?
Yeah, well, Evan, as you know, the need for broadband really exploded during the pandemic. And as you're also aware, this is something, when I was in the House and now in the Senate, that has been one of my main focuses. How do you close that digital divide? And then how do you make certain that individuals have access to the needed technology? Because you cannot have 21st century economic development, education, healthcare, or law enforcement without access to high-speed internet. Now, during the pandemic, we were really very pleased to see the CARES Act include much of our language for telehealth. And when you talk with your doctors, your healthcare providers, your hospitals, what you're finding out is much of their continuum of care, especially for individuals with complex medical conditions, took place because of telehealth. Then likewise with our schools, we have worked with them as they have sought remedies to be certain that children had access to high-speed internet. Now, some school systems put hotspots on school buses that then would take meals and supplies out to local community centers. You also had some school districts that worked with churches and community centers to make space available for children to come and work either in a fellowship hall or working in a vehicle with their parents in order to get work done. Now, legislatively, recently, my Internet Exchange Act, which will allow these data hubs, it will make it more affordable for districts to put these data hubs that are necessary for broadband expansion in place. That was recently approved and is now in federal law. This is a very solid step. This is bipartisan legislation. Senator Tammy Baldwin and I have worked on this issue, and we're pleased that the Internet Exchange Act has now moved forward to make it more affordable for our systems and our counties to get these internet exchange hubs, these data hubs in place. We're continuing as we look at infrastructure. The number one issue that we hear about from our local and state elected officials is the need for additional funds for internet expansion. And in Tennessee, we have been so very fortunate that our state legislature has put a tremendous amount of funding forward for high-speed internet, for broadband expansion. And then as 5G technologies come forward, for the expansion and utilization of wireless for internet connectivity.
And so along those lines, just a follow-up on that, with the federal infrastructure legislation being talked about, do you see more funding coming down from Washington to the states for broadband?
We are certainly hopeful. Of course, there are different pockets of funding for high-speed internet, whether it is funding through the FCC or funding through rural development for communities that have not had access. This would be for areas that are unserved. We also know that the CARES funding carry forward fund dollars for high-speed internet connectivity. And then as we talk about infrastructure, there are some of us that are working diligently to make broadband a part of that infrastructure package.
Okay. And I know as a member of the Commerce Committee, I know you're pretty involved in the infrastructure bill. How do you think that the current framework is going, and do you have a timeline or update on that?
We don't have a timeline. There are still talks that are ongoing. I think it is fair to say that there is a view that most Republicans have for a package that deals with your roads and bridges, your runways and airports, your rivers and your waterways, and then your railways, all of which are important to us in Tennessee. To that, we add broadband, which is necessary. And then there are some who would like to put in components of the Green New Deal or money for other things that really we do not consider traditional infrastructure. When I talk to Tennesseans, they want those roads and rivers and rails and runways and broadband. Those are the 5 things that they want to see in an infrastructure bill. So we're continuing to work. I wish I had an update on timing. At this point, we do not.
Okay. And so another big issue, that's been coming up a lot is workforce and how that goes. How do you see the federal government playing a role in workforce, particularly in helping some of the states get folks back to work?
Yes, well, getting people back to work, ending the federal plus up in unemployment is something that Tennessee has already chosen to do. And I am aware that as this has happened, then there have been more people that have elected to go back to work. So we know that is going to help. Likewise, we have seen Congress step in with the payroll protection program, the PPP program. In Tennessee, we had a large number of small businesses take advantage of this program because it allowed them to keep their doors open and to keep people on the payroll during the pandemic. I had legislation that dealt with the EIDL program, and we were pleased to see that take place. That really helped our businesses to separate that idle money from the PPP money when it came to getting that grant to keep the doors open, and then the loan that they would have to meet certain qualifications on how they were going to pay that back or either receive loan forgiveness.
Okay. And also along the lines of workforce, just to talk a little bit on the vaccines and Operation Warp Speed, that's come down from the federal level. What do you feel could be done to address some of the hesitation of folks to get vaccinated?
Yeah, before I talk about the vaccine, let me say this on workforce. Senator Jackie Rosen and I are working together on a workforce training bill that would be for advanced manufacturing. This is something that is important for the East Tennessee, Oak Ridge sort of corridor. You have some components that are there around Chattanooga, some companies that would would benefit from some of these components of the bill. But this would be to assist in training a workforce for advanced manufacturing and employing some of those concepts. Now, this is also legislation that would be important to our TCATs, because we know as more manufacturing comes back to the US, because of some of the China pressures that are out there, having a trained workforce is going to be vitally important. Now, when it comes to vaccines, I tell people to make certain that they are talking to their physician, not to be believing everything they're reading on the internet, but they need to be talking to their physician about the vaccine. I've chosen to get the vaccine, as have other members of my family. We know that there are some individuals who have complex medical issues that their physicians have told them they would recommend that they not receive the vaccine. So this is going to be a question for someone with their healthcare professional who understands their medical conditions or the state of their health.
Okay. And just to switch gears just a little bit, but as you know, we have the Chattanooga Lookouts, and they've been an institution in Chattanooga and in our area for some time. You recently sponsored the Minor League Baseball Relief Act. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I will be happy to. And just this morning, Senator Blumenthal, who is the Democratic lead on this legislation, and I did a segment with CBS News. They're doing a package about this, and I think they're going to actually come to Chattanooga. And what we know is that you have teams like the Lookouts there in Chattanooga that are in different cities around our state. And minor league baseball, these are ballparks that were shuttered during COVID. Now, you had the PPP loan program for small businesses. You had the shuttered venue operator grants for your concert halls and your entertainment venues. But what we realized is that your sporting venues, your minor league venues had been left out of this. Now, the legislation is very narrowly drawn. It repurposes and repositions unused funds from the SBA program, the PPP program, so that minor league ballparks can now apply for that. These are traditionally owned by individuals and their small business operations. And this would allow a ball team to access 45% of a loan that is equivalent to 45% of their 2019 operating venues. And then for vendors that work those ballparks, up to $100,000. Now, these cannot be accessed by any team that is majority owned by Major League Baseball. So it has to go to these small venues and operations like the Chattanooga Lookouts. And these ball teams are a big part of the community. You just mentioned how long they have been there in Chattanooga. And of course, this is a way for families to come and be able to see what pro sports are about, for children who are involved in baseball to be able to watch very talented players. It is a way for kids to be encouraged to dream those big dreams. And these ball teams have different programs. You know, one of the things with the Lookouts is they have the Little Debbie Little Lookouts program, and this is a way to involve children. You have local singers that come in, or choirs, and they do the national anthem. These are doors of opportunity for our citizens. So to open some of these funds that have not been utilized to minor league ball teams that are there in these communities, we think that that's the appropriate thing to do.
Yeah, and we thank you for your support of that and your work on that. Because again, that's very important, as you pointed out, just the different groups that come together locally that normally wouldn't be together or there together at a baseball game. So that's very important. Could you tell us how the business community can better support you in DC?
You know, one of the things that is very helpful to us, and Evan, I will tell you, this is one of the things I so enjoy when I'm able to actually go and visit with people. Recently, in the last, I guess, 2 or 3 months, I did a roundtable with the Chamber's transportation group, being able to hear what is impacting Chattanooga businesses, what is impacting business in the region. And, when I'm able to sit down and talk with citizens and talk with some of these companies, I hear firsthand how some of the work that is being done in DC is either helpful or is creating some type adverse effect. Maybe it's an unintended consequence. So it is very helpful to us to get that information firsthand.
And could you talk a little bit about, I know with most of our folks, we don't really know what was happening in Washington outside of what you see on TV or what's on social media. Could you talk a little bit about just going back to when you were first elected into the House and now being the senior senator of Tennessee? What is your perspective on what's changed in Washington and how's the atmosphere to you?
Well, one of the things that everybody comments on when I'm out and about in Tennessee is they see all the public partisanship and they're going, how do you get anything done? But what they don't realize is there is a lot of bipartisan work that is taking place. I've referenced workforce, I've referenced broadband expansion, the minor league baseball legislation, all of that is being done in a bipartisan way. Likewise, working on electronic health records to better the health care available to our veterans. That is something Senator Tester and I are working on in a bipartisan way. So I think many times people look at what they're seeing on TV and they don't realize that there is indeed quite a bit of bipartisan work being done. One of the differences in representing a congressional district as opposed to the entire state is just the scope and the, being able to keep up with the amount of work. But we have a fantastic team that is there in the state. We have 6 offices. We have everybody out and about. We have caseworkers that are doing the work that comes in where people are needing help with the federal agency. And we're doing our best to stay in contact every single day, because covering the whole state from Mountain City down to Memphis really does take a lot of time in the car.
Yeah, and you truly have a great staff in the state, and that starts from the top, and we appreciate all their work.
Sure.
I have one final question. Just as someone who's written a book, could you give our audience any recommendations on any reading they could do to add to their list?
Yes, there is a book that I started reading during the July 4th weekend. Jason Riley, who writes for the Wall Street Journal, has written this. The book title is Maverick, and it is about one of the most significant economists and public opinion thinkers and influencers of our time, Thomas Sowell. And I would encourage everyone to read that. There is also another book, and this one is a Liz Wiseman book. It's called Multipliers. And it is so significant about the approach you take in leading a team. Are you helping people to multiply and expand their talents, or are you putting people in a situation where you diminish their talents? And that is something for those of us that lead a team, that is important to think about, having the right person in the right slot. And I've really enjoyed reading that book. So those are 2 of the 2 that are at the top of my list.
Okay, thanks for sharing those.
Sure.
And again, Senator, thank you so much for all that you do for the state of Tennessee, and you have done and will continue to do. And any way that we can be supportive, please reach out to us, and we're always willing to work hand in hand with you.
I'm delighted to join you, and I would encourage your members to follow us, blackburn.senate.gov. We have a newsletter we send out every single Friday that talks about the things that are going on in DC and how this impacts our state. It also will, when we're getting ready to accept new college students for internships, that information is in there. We have information for parents and for teachers if they're planning trips to Washington. And of course, your members will find us on social media at Marsha Blackburn.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Senator Blackburn. Evan, great job. Next up, a conversation with our new senator, Senator Bill Hagerty. Hello again, everybody. I am Justin Grainert, Vice President of Public Affairs for the Chattanooga Chamber of Commerce. I am pleased to have Senator Bill Hagerty with us today. Senator Hagerty was elected to the United States Senate in November of 2020. He is not a stranger to the state, having built a business here, as well as serving in the Haslam administration, state government, and most recently was the ambassador to Japan in the Trump administration. He is currently a member of the Appropriations Committee. He's on the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, the Foreign Relations Committee, and the Committee on Rules and Administration. Senator, welcome.
Justin, it's great to be with you and back with my friends from Chattanooga today. And as you say, no stranger to the area. It was one of the greatest experiences of my life to serve as the Secretary of Economic and Community Development there in Tennessee at a time when we were working our way out of the last recession. Tennessee's unemployment was higher than the national average. When we came into office, our economic numbers were not where we wanted them to be at all. And to be part of that great turnaround, to see Tennessee's economy now performing at such high levels, it was a great honor and a great set of experiences to have and bring with me to the United States Senate.
So as the newest member of the Southeast Tennessee delegation, what's your first impression of your short time in Washington so far?
My first impression is thank God we're from Tennessee, Justin. Tennessee has got so many positive things happening, setting the pandemic aside. We've got a terrific state. We've got a very business-friendly climate. You think about the fact that we're a right-to-work state. We are a very low tax state, no individual tax. From a regulatory standpoint, businesses find it easy to survive and thrive. And the net result of that has been that our economy has flourished. And again, go back to my days as economic development chief. We really worked hard to put in place the environment so that would happen. I recruited like crazy when I was in my job, and for 4 years we turned things around. And as I said, when I took that job on, Tennessee was in the bottom half of all the economic metrics. And by the time I left 4 years later, Tennessee had become the #1 state in the nation for economic development, 2 of those 4 years. And we had become the #1 state in America for jobs created through foreign direct investment. And that again sort of played into my experience as U.S. ambassador to Japan, because the vast majority of that foreign investment that we attracted during my time in the economic development seat was from Japan, 60% of it, so more than all the other nations combined. It helped that I lived and worked at one point in Japan from 88 to 91. My former firm, the Boston Consulting Group, sent me there. That's how I learned the language. That's how I learned the economy. It was a very different time, but that was a real advantage for us in terms of recruiting more investment, creating more jobs in Tennessee, and creating greater economic prosperity.
So with some of those background, you've kind of laid out some of that background, but tell us a little bit more about yourself, kind of how you got to the United States Senate and how you think those experiences will propel your career in the Senate.
Well, I'm a small town kid from Middle Tennessee, Sumner County. Where Gallatin is, we had a small farm in a place called Castallion Springs. I was the president of my FFA chapter. I grew up raising cattle and pigs. I worked my way through school shoveling asphalt on the road crew, same as my father, same as my grandfather. And I was the first young man in my family to graduate college. So I really, wound up having a career that I couldn't have imagined as a kid from a small town. I wound up working on 5 different continents. As I mentioned, I lived in Tokyo, Japan for 3 years. But that sort of experience gave me an opportunity to really live the American dream. And I appreciate that. I want to see that for all Americans. I think that a good job solves so many other sort of social problems that we may encounter. And bringing that type of economic background, that type of experience and understanding and insight to the United States Senate, I think is absolutely critical given the challenges that we face today. Look, our economy has been devastated by this pandemic. We've got challenges here domestically, we've got challenges internationally. And the fact that I've had that sort of broad-based working experience, I understand how the economy works, and the fact that I served during the Trump administration as the United States ambassador to Japan, which is the third largest economy in the world after the US and China. I think that sort of diplomatic and national security experience as well has given me just a terrific background, a terrific foundation to come in and serve the people of Tennessee.
Well, it does look like your committee assignments certainly do represent your background well. One of the things that I know that you've had a lot to say on, and I think it's important to kind of get into a little bit, especially with your role in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is the U.S.-China relationship.
Sure.
Talk to us about that, because it is critically important on one hand. However, it's obviously a point of contention on another. Talk to us a little bit about that, some of the background and sort of where you see that relationship going, and what does the United States need to do to protect itself?
Well, Justin, first I'd say this. I mentioned that China is the second largest economy in the world. It is far too large a market to ignore, but it is far too critical an entity to let them continue to behave as they have. We've got to learn how to stand up to China, how to get them to behave like a market economy the way we do, to play according to the rules the way we do. And when they don't, we need to call them out. I've dealt with China. I've lived in the region. One of the key regions I was stationed in Japan is the fact that we've got more US military there than any place else in the world. Why? Because we're dealing with North Korea, Russia, and China every day. China is aggressive from a military standpoint. They're aggressive from a diplomatic standpoint. They're very aggressive from an economic standpoint. I think most of your members understand that. When it comes to intellectual property theft, we got to stand up against that. When it comes to the fact that they deeply subsidize their champion industries and use that to unfairly compete against ours, we've got to stand up against that. We've got to make certain that they make their markets open to our products the way we have made our markets open to theirs. It's that type of posture, strength, that China understands. That's why I've advocated to keep a very strong military posture in the region. I support the quad work that we're doing with Japan, with India, with Australia, to continue to ensure that we've got freedom of navigation of air travel and commerce along the South China Sea, the East China Sea, one of the busiest, commerce routes in the world. This is critically important. And we've got to maintain a constructive relationship with China, but one that holds them in check. And I will be the first to say that we need to make certain that we hold China accountable for this pandemic. Regardless of how the virus escaped, we know that they took steps to cover it up. We know that they destroyed samples. We know that they silenced researchers. We even know that they forbade internal travel from Wuhan to Beijing. You couldn't get a flight. Yet they allowed flights to fly from Wuhan to Italy. They allowed flights to fly to North America. They are responsible for the worldwide spread of this pandemic. And when they come around and try to use vaccine diplomacy to act as though they're the savior, I think that's something we got to stand up against very strongly.
Obviously, trade is a big piece of this, and it's bigger than just China. What are your views on trade in general, and how can we be as competitive as possible in terms of getting our products to the world?
Well, first and foremost, we need to have a very competitive domestic local market. When we put in place the Tax Reform Act of 2017, we took America's corporate tax rate from the least competitive in the world at 35% down to one that is fairly competitive at 21%. We need to retain that sort of competitive posture. We need to make American companies competitive, and we need to make the American market the most attractive in the world to invest in. I appreciate that very deeply. When it comes to trade, no one worked harder than I did on the US-Japan trade deal. As Bob Lighthizer, our trade rep at the time, said, he felt it was the best deal that he cut, that we cut as a nation during the previous administration. I worked very hard to make certain that all of the dynamics were in place to get that deal done, to continue to advance the ball for America and see that we opened up Japan's markets, again, the number 3 largest economy in the world, to particularly America's agricultural exports. It's also a huge deal in terms of our digital trade between the nations. So I think that America's interests are advanced when we have free, fair, and reciprocal trade arrangements with our partners. You see a lot of consternation coming from Europe right now. They don't want to come to the table on a trade deal, but it's because so many of the concessions that they won post-World War II, again, this was designed to help rebuild their economies. Those conditions should have been time limited. They were not. As a result, you've got anomalies. You take the automotive sector, which is very strong in Tennessee. Why is it that when we sell a car to Europe, there's a 10% tariff, yet when they sell one to us, it's 2.5%? That's imbalanced, that's not fair, that's not reciprocal. These are the types of things I'd like to see improved, and I think that America will gain, I think the world will gain, as we find reciprocity with our trading partners.
That's awesome. I think that's very important as well, especially with the amount of automotive that we have. One of the things that we obviously have seen, and I know that you've probably heard, the pandemic obviously exacerbated a lot of problems that were kind of already there, just sort of sped them up. And one of the things that I think we've seen a lot of issues with is our supply chains, obviously. What can the federal government do, in your estimation, to protect our supply chains, both at home and abroad, to make sure that our manufacturing sector can do what they need to do to get products out to consumers?
I think one of the most important federal level protections that we can do is make certain that we have clean communication channels. That means not allowing providers like Huawei into our system, where we can expose and make vulnerable American corporations' secrets, American corporations' data, things that would allow the continued theft of intellectual property that we know has occurred with China and with other nations. So from a federal standpoint, I think that's something that we need to continue to push. The United States government stepped up, blocked Huawei and its ilk from becoming part of our next generation 5G network. I worked very hard when I was U.S. ambassador to Japan to get Japan to do the same thing. They did. New Zealand, Australia have followed suit. I'm optimistic the UK will soon. We need to work hard to get all of our allies to make certain that we have clean networks to operate across. Because if you think about how supply chains are managed, it's managed across these large networks. When it comes to the environment in which our companies operate, where they source product, I think American companies have woken up, and this happened well before the pandemic. Again, when I served as ambassador to Japan, very often American CEOs would come and visit me as they toured Asia. They were very concerned about their exposure to communist China. And I would say, on the whole, American CEOs, American boards were not approving new investment in China unless it was for the domestic market. They were doing everything they could at that point to move supply chains out, to move any excess capacity that was available in the system outside of China. They were looking to fill that capacity in other places. I think that trend will continue. What's been underscored by the pandemic is the fact that just-in-time manufacturing, as it does drive efficiency, also exposes vulnerabilities. And I think what we'll see is a trend toward reshoring. I'm going to work as hard as I can to get as many jobs back to America as I possibly can. But to the extent that those jobs aren't coming back to America, I think you're going to see them nearshored, meaning looking to our partners in Central America, in Mexico. You hear a lot of talk right now about root causes of the immigration problem. I can tell you the root cause, the immediate problem, is the Biden administration, the messages that they're sending by collapsing our border and encouraging the sort of mayhem that we see right now. But longer term, in the middle to long range, I think that we have great opportunity to, as we reshore these jobs from China, if they're not coming to America, to help put them into a place in this hemisphere with our allies, here in our own neighborhood.
That's, again, in that same vein, computer chips, battery technology. As we continue to advance technology in cars, computers, all of that, obviously computer chips and battery technology is going to be critical, especially for our region in the state of Tennessee with as much automotive as we had. What can be done at the federal level to either support better supply chains for those two entities, or how can we better incentivize computer chip technology and battery technology to be made here in America?
Well, the absolute best thing we can do to encourage made in America is to create the best possible environment to invest capital in America. That means low taxes, that means business-friendly regulations, get rid of the sclerosis, get rid of the duplicity in the regulations, make permitting easier. Those are the types of things that I want to see done. The Endless Frontiers Act that just passed has $52 billion in it to support chip manufacturing, but rather than have subsidies, rather than have that type of environment, what I want to see is to create the most favorable environment for capital investment ever. You've got it happening here right now. I was there for the announcement with LG from South Korea and GM putting a major battery facility into Middle Tennessee, SK just south of Chattanooga there in North Georgia, another major investment in batteries. We're going to continue to see the automotive industry thrive in America. We're going to see it continue to thrive in Tennessee. But in the long run, the very best way to make certain that that happens is to have policies that are supportive of the economy, that are supportive of capital investment. That will drive our success, and that's where I'm focusing my attention.
That's, again, another great way to continue to grow the economy in our part of the world, especially within the United States and globally. Ransomware has become quite a problem, especially with larger corporations and entire sectors of the economy. What do you see can be done to prevent hackers from holding businesses digitally hostage? And how do we protect businesses and industries that are important to our economy to keep prices spiking, keeping prices from spiking?
Well, as a nation, we need to be clear that no industry and no company that's hacked is acceptable. Rather than submit a list of 16 industries that need to be not touched, as just happened between President Biden and President Putin, we should say no industry in America should be touched. This should be a zero tolerance environment, and we should not encourage, support, or approve of the payment of ransom, which is exactly what this administration is doing right now. I'm against it. And I think that we need to stand strong. We need to help strengthen our networks, and we need to stand up and use all the resources that are at our disposal to push back whenever this occurs.
So you've got a couple of busy weeks. If you've read the newspapers, for those of us that are following along, obviously there's a lot of things on your plate heading into the August recess. We have infrastructure. You recently held a roundtable in Chattanooga to discuss infrastructure. What did you take from that meeting? And what are your thoughts on the current proposal being floated? How does that look going forward in the next couple of weeks?
The takeaway from my meeting in Chattanooga there and my meetings across the state are that Tennesseans and Americans, I think, support investment that can generate a positive return on investment. That's hard, tangible, real infrastructure. What's happening here right now, we've got two packages. One is called a bipartisan package. That's the product of a negotiation between a small team of Republicans, Democrats, and the White House. We've also got something called reconciliation, which President Biden has promised to shove through again on the American people. As a business person, I find it very hard to accept an environment where somebody says, let's come to the table, let's agree on the things that we can agree upon, and everything else that I want in the deal, I'm just going to shove through anyway. That's not a bipartisan negotiation. I haven't seen the details of this package. They haven't been drafted yet. I'm very discouraged by the environment, though, so we'll wait and see what happens. Again, Americans and Tennesseans, I think, approve of investment in real infrastructure, but what's happening, what I'm seeing unfold here right now, is something less than a bipartisan approach to that.
We do have, you mentioned the corporate tax rate earlier, and that's one of the things I think that is going to be part of the discussion. Obviously, the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress have made no bones about trying to attack the tax deal that was struck under the Trump administration. Where do you see that conversation going? Obviously, there's going to be a spike in federal spending, as we've seen with the reconciliation bill, and then talk of anywhere from a $3 trillion to $6 trillion package, depending on which segment of the Democratic Party gets their way in the Senate. Where do you see taxes going from here, and how do you see the business community needing to react to sort of the uncertainty that's now sort of back in the system?
What I can say is that coming out of a pandemic, coming out of a recession, the last thing you should do is increase taxes, yet that's exactly what the Democrats in Congress are proposing. And they're proposing to do it in a way that actually will make America less competitive. If they want to tax capital, if they want to tax corporate earnings, they're going to make America less competitive on the global horizon. I think that's exactly the wrong turn to take, particularly right now as we're recovering from a recession. The level of spending that we've incurred, again, what happened last year before I was in the Senate, I think was done on a bipartisan basis because the members of the Senate, the members of the House realized that we needed to get through a pandemic, an unprecedented pandemic. But what I saw happen here in March of this year was a completely partisan $1.9 trillion package that was shoved through without a single Republican vote at a time when we're already seeing inflation take off. What we're seeing happen today is an unprecedented level of inflation. That's got me concerned. I think we're looking back to the Jimmy Carter years right now. And what we hear coming from the Democrats is a desire to shove through, as you said, numbers in the trillions of dollars. Much of this having nothing to do with what you or I or the people on this podcast would think of as traditional infrastructure. We've got to put a halt to this. I'm going to stand up against it.
All right, we got one final question. What is one book that you would recommend to our audience that they add to their bookshelves? And it can be more than one if you have several. But
I'm going to share with you one that's not a popular title, but it's one that I would encourage the business community of Tennessee to look up. It's called Henderson on Corporate Strategy, written by a man named Bruce Henderson, graduate of Vanderbilt from Walter Hill, Tennessee, near Murfreesboro. Bruce Henderson founded the firm that I started my career in, called the Boston Consulting Group, BCG. I was just over about, 4 or 5 weeks ago in Israel, meeting with Bibi Netanyahu. We spent an hour and a half together. Bibi started his career at the Boston Consulting Group too. We both spent our time talking about how Bruce Henderson's philosophy had affected our view of business. Bibi talked about how when he was finance secretary of Israel, how Bruce's philosophy had helped him think about how to grow the economy there. I shared with him about how Bruce's philosophy on competitiveness helped me think about Tennessee's economy too. So I would encourage people to look up Bruce Henderson on Corporate Strategy, again, from a Tennessean who founded one of the preeminent strategy consulting firms in the world. That would be my recommendation.
Fantastic. Well, Senator, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your service to our state. We look forward to having you in person in Chattanooga sometime soon. So we'll have Stan settles on speed dial to make sure we can get that to happen. And again, we appreciate your time today and look forward to having you back here in the future.
Great. Thanks very much. Great to be with you.
Thanks, Senator. We'd like to thank Senator Haggerty for his time and look forward to working with him going forward. Next up, we have a conversation with Congressman Chuck Fleischmann.
I'm Sharon Law with Thompson Engineering here in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I would like to introduce Representative Chuck Fleischmann, who represents the 3rd District of Tennessee. He was elected in 2010. Fleischmann serves on the Appropriations Committee, which is vitally important to the residents of the 3rd District. Within the committee, he serves on 3 crucial subcommittees: Energy and Water Development and related agencies, Labor, Health and Human Services, Education and related agencies, and Homeland Security. Representative, thank you for joining us today. How's Brenda?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Brenda is doing very well. I'm in Washington today in my office. She is home in Ottawa, but I will tell her you all asked about it.
How would you describe the current state of Congress and Washington in general?
Well, right now, unfortunately, similar to when I came to Congress about 10 years ago, we're seeing a time where there is polarization, and I'll be specific about that. We've got largely the two-party system, people going to their respective corners, advocating for their respective districts, and really, in many ways, that's how it ought to be. I represent the districts of the desires of the majority of the people in my district. But right now it's a bit partisan, but I'm the eternal optimist. It is polarized, it is partisan, but I came to Congress to get things done. I've been able to accomplish quite a bit in my 10-year tenure, actually in my 11th year. So serving on the Appropriations Committee, it gives me an opportunity to still be a very active member. So I'm going to continue to be that optimist, to work towards getting more done. But candidly, right now, we are a bit polarized.
You serve on the Appropriations Committee. Describe the role it plays in the legislative process.
Well, the Appropriations Committee is a coveted committee. The vast majority of members of Congress, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, are known as authorizers. Those are people who would basically make the laws, if you will. If there was a bill out there telling people what to do, authorizers do that. So the extreme minority of people in Congress, and I'm in that group, are appropriators. And what that means is whether you're a Republican or a Democratic member of the Appropriations Committee, this is the committee that controls all of the spending, especially the what we'd call discretionary spending in Congress. What does that mean? Defense, education, energy and water, you name it. If it's out there on the non-mandatory side of the spending equation, it goes through my committee. Out of 9 members in Tennessee in the House, I'm the only member, Republican or Democratic, who serves on that committee. Historically, that has not been the case. Historically, Tennessee has had, before I got there, 2 members on the Appropriation Committee, usually 1 Republican and 1 Democrat. So now I am the only member on the committee of our 9 delegations. So it's critically important. What does that mean? That means that funding for the Chattanooga Oak Ridge partnership that is out there between our great national lab and our great city of Chattanooga. By the way, the Chamber of Commerce has been a wonderful, strong catalyst and supporter of those endeavors. But I'm in a key place, in a key role, and right now I'm a senior appropriator. In your opening, you alluded to the fact that I'm on 3 key subcommittees of the 12 that are on the full committee. That's very important because even though I serve in the minority, my party, the Republicans, are in the minority in the House, I still serve on 3 major subcommittees on the full appropriations committee. That is rare, but that is very important.
Continuing resolutions have tended to be the way the government has been funded in recent history. Do you foresee a return to a more regular order on the budget process in the House?
It's another great question. For somebody who would be watching that, what is a continuing resolution? Well, in a nutshell, it's a failure. And let me try to explain that, why it's a failure. Obviously, it's preferable to a government shutdown. We can have 3 things happen. We can have a budget bill passed, an annual appropriations budget bill passed. We can have a continuing resolution, or God forbid, a government shutdown. And during my 11 years, we have had the government shut down a few times. It is not pretty, it is not nice, and it is not good government. In my view, it's inexcusable. But I don't think there's any appetite for that. But being candid and honest with everybody, you've always got to put that out as a potential. But the next worst thing is a continuing resolution, because what that basically does, it takes the prior year's budget, whatever that looked like, whatever those priorities were, for example, in fiscal 2021 this year, and it duplicates that in 2022. So you get exactly what you got. It's a continuing resolution. It's a continuation of what we did the year earlier. And why is that not good? Well, first of all, it's a very lazy, ineffective way to do government. That means we didn't get a budget passed, but the needs of the nation have changed in a year. There may be more needs in the education area. There may be more needs in defense. There may be more needs in energy and water. I'll give you a prime example. Last year, fortunately, I was able to get full funding finally for the Chickamauga Lock project. That was $191 million. That has kind of ebbed and flowed over the years, but that project is fully funded. But certain years, you will need more dollars for certain projects, and other years you will need less. The uranium processing facility in Oak Ridge, critically important, the largest construction project in the state of Tennessee's history. There have been years where we've been, well over $700 million while we were going upwards on a construction curve. Now we are on the downward side of that. That should be open by 2025. And the request this year will be probably about $520 million. What I mean by that is they just won't need as much money as they did the year before. But if you get a continuing resolution, you're just locked in. So having said that, what is the chance of getting a real budget? Right now, this week, while everybody else in Congress is home, I'm up here working on appropriation bills, on all 12 appropriation bills. They will all be passed out of the full appropriation committee and then go to the floor. Some will pass, some will not. We hope our dear friends up the hall in a little place called the United States Senate work equally as well. Candidly, some years they do a better job than us in the House, and other years we do a better job than the Senate. There are some years that the Senate doesn't move their appropriation bills. Hopefully they will do that this year. So if both bodies do their job, do their work, and pass their appropriation bills, they can come together in what we call a conference, come up with an agreed upon budget, and then send it on to the president for his signature. Will that happen? It's an up in the air question right now. There's a lot of work. There's a lot more to be done. It is a contentious environment right now. It's a polarized environment, but appropriators, generally speaking, tend to work a lot better with others across the aisle and within the aisle to get things done. That's the very nature of an appropriator. So I'm going to remain optimistic. My point is I'm going to continue to work very hard to get things done.
We know you will. As you said, infrastructure's been the hot topic in Washington for several months now. The House recently passed a bill. The Senate has a bipartisan framework on a larger infrastructure package. Where do you think this legislation goes in the coming weeks?
I'm very concerned. Sometimes it's day to day the way I feel about that. I did not vote for the House bill, and let me tell you why. To me, infrastructure means roads, it means bridges, it means broadband, it means locks and dams, things that a third grader would call infrastructure. It is not a social justice bill. It is not a Green New Deal. And unfortunately, that's what we have seen in the House bill. But just recently, Senator Schumer, the majority leader in the Senate, came out with a $3.5 trillion bill, took it in the wrong direction and loaded it up with all of those things that will just be totally unpalatable to myself and to members of my party. So what is the solution? To get back to basics, come up with a bill that is reasonable in size, and I'll be specific, $900 million to $1 trillion, I think we could agree upon, and then do a traditional infrastructure bill that is responsibly funded. Roads, bridges, locks, dams, infrastructure, internet, broadband, those type of things that the average American will say, yes, that ought to be in an infrastructure bill. So the jury is still out on that. We need an infrastructure bill in this country desperately. Other countries are investing billions in their infrastructure. The United States has got to do that in order to keep up. We've got the world's largest, strongest economy. I want to make sure that as we move our goods and services all over this country, we have a strong infrastructure to do that with. But in order to do that, we've got to get back, I think, to common sense definitions and avoid trying to put things in these type bills that just ought not be in an infrastructure bill.
Well, thank you for that. Clean energy has long been discussed. What role do you see for the federal government, and how can we capitalize on renewable energy?
Well, I have long supported clean energy. I am very blessed and privileged to have a little place up the road called the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which has been a national leader. Let's face it, this is the largest and strongest national lab in the country. There are 17 national labs. It's almost indisputable that the Oak Ridge National Lab is the #1 science lab. So we are leading in all types of research. And since I've been in Congress, I've been immersed in that. So that could be anything as important as battery storage, which we've got to make gains. By the way, we've driven the cost down. We've driven the capacity up. We're not there yet. Nuclear energy. I'm a national leader. I work with Republicans and Democrats and lead in that area. I work with members of the House and Senate and lead in that area. So it's easy to do when you've got the great resources that we've got in that sphere. We're looking at designing and building microreactors, a whole new generation of new nuclear reactors that are safer, less expensive, easier to build, easier to license, and fit the market really for the rest of the world. But there are so many different things that we can do in the clean energy space. The other thing that I think I'm extremely pleased about is the Chattanooga Oak Ridge partnership. If I look back at what I've been able to accomplish, I think getting the Chickamauga Lock, obviously that's a rather parochial thing, fully funded, was very important. But the thing that I'm most proud of is the partnership that we have created with Chattanooga businesses, largely through the Electric Power Board, EPB, and the Oak Ridge National Lab. Secretary Moniz came to me years ago and he said, we want to get a great national lab off of its parochial reservation. They do a good job, and into a city. And I said, that's great. I've got the city for you. I've got the greatest mid-sized city in the world, the strongest chamber of commerce in the world. I think the greatest business community in the world in Chattanooga. Go to Chattanooga, you won't regret it. Nobody did. It's been mutually beneficial. So all of this means that there's going to be a lot of work on clean energy. We want to make sure, absolutely certain, that as we move forward, that we can take these ideas to market and that they will work. But I've talked to world leaders about what we're doing in clean energy, and our technological ability is incredible. But I also want to make sure our friends in the private sector, particularly in Chattanooga, have a shot at that.
Last year was very difficult for many of us. Congress stepped up to the plate in a big way to address the COVID-19 pandemic, sending trillions of dollars into the economy. Where do you see federal spending headed as we move away from the economic fallout from the pandemic, and the debt ceiling expires on July 31st? So is there a concern that it will not be raised by the deadline?
It's another excellent question. And let's talk about where we are right now. And this does concern me, but I want to talk about the different drivers of debt and be abundantly candid with our listeners. When I came to Congress, the federal national debt was about $15 trillion. Currently, it approaches $30 trillion. Now, at the inception, I was talking about what I do in Congress, and I was totally honest and transparent about that. I'm the appropriator. I sit in the Appropriations Committee. And what does the Appropriations Committee do? They spend on the discretionary side. Now, where is the problem? The problem driving our federal deficits has been for decades the mandatory spending programs. That right now is over 70% of our federal budget. Let me put that in a snapshot. That would mean that if we were a family at a dinner table and we were sitting down doing our budget, if 70+% of it was already spent and decided on things that we couldn't budget for, it was automatically recurring. And what are those things? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the national debt, probably about 85% of the Affordable Care Act. These are automatically recurring things. Now, what did affect us? COVID. We talked about COVID. We had a situation, candidly, where the federal government during the COVID situation passed stimulus bills, and these were in the trillions of dollars. These were largely done with borrowed money. So that added to the national debt. So where do I see the federal government going? At some point in time, we're going to have to sit down and have a fiscal reckoning, have a candid conversation with the American people to sit down and talk about it. We cannot tax our way out of it. It's a spending problem. And if these are figures we're looking at that are not Republican figures and not Democratic figures. And I found that when I'm having conversations with my constituents, it's best to be candid and non-political. There are times to be political on either side of that. I understand that. But when you're representing your clients, be honest. We've got to have a national discussion on fiscal responsibility. It's inevitable because we cannot continue to have this go on. Now, to answer your specific question about the debt ceiling, when the debt ceiling comes up, it will be raised. Why will it be raised? Because this is money that is already spent. So it'd be a situation that if somebody went out and spent money or borrowed money, which they did, the federal government did, they are certainly not going to put the federal government into a default position on debt. It would have catastrophic effects globally in our markets and the like. I think the real solution is going to be, before that debt gets addressed and that debt limit raised to accommodate what we've already spent, to sit down to see if we can get some form of fiscal structure, fiscal responsibility put into place. An easy answer, obviously, would be a balanced budget amendment to the federal constitution. There is no appetite for that. I have voted for that, but our great state of Tennessee, by constitution, by state constitution, requires a balanced budget every year. Some states do and some states don't. But I've long advocated for that type of fiscal restraint at the national level. But right now, there's no appetite. And candidly, during the last three major presidential races, the last three, whether they were Republicans or Democrats running for office, there has been no talk about dealing with our nation's national debt. That I think is sad. I think we need to have that discourse because younger people such as yourself and other people watching, you have that debt out there on each American citizen. What does that mean? That will affect ultimately the quality of their life. So our children and grandchildren are going to be burdened with the dollars that we spend and or borrow today.
Well, thank you for the younger people comment. We're now best friends. And we certainly appreciate your commitment to the Chamber and our business community. So what can we do to better support you in your work in Congress?
It's an excellent question. I have long been a supporter and member of the Chattanooga Area Chamber of Commerce. When I was a young lawyer, came to Chattanooga in 1986, I joined the Chattanooga Area Chamber of Commerce. When I opened up my own law firm on June 1st of 1987, until the day I closed it on December 31st, 2010, before I took this job, I was a strong, vibrant member. I was an active member. And I was so glad to see our Chamber of Commerce do what I think Chamber of Commerces need to do, support businesses. And as long as the Chattanooga Chamber of Commerce is out there working to help Chattanooga entrepreneurs start businesses, maintain businesses, grow businesses, attract businesses, you'll be on the right track. I think business, commerce, trade is the way to go. We've seen Chattanooga become a Renaissance city. Chattanooga in 1986 versus 2021 is a completely different city. I think working to make sure that commerce is vibrant. That's what you can do to help me. What I can do to help you is keep taxes and regulations low, make sure that we do things to keep credit flowing to businesses. I'm a pro-business person, lock, stock, and barrel. I think when businesses do well, everybody does well, top to bottom.
How do you balance your time between the 11 districts you serve and DC?
Great question. I don't. I go 24/7. I wake up at night worrying about my district, my constituents, caring about them, loving them. I just had a meeting with our great friends at the Tennessee Farm Bureau, just came into my office. I love to meet with my constituents. I love to get into their issues. But when I practice law 7 days a week. When I practice Congress, I do it 7 days a week. It's very difficult to balance. To be candid, there is none. There are days that we get involved in things and you work on it, you give it everything you've got, you hope for success. Most of the time you win, sometimes you don't. If you don't, you get up the next day and you say, how do we better address this issue? And I just want my constituents to know that whether they're in Hamilton County or in rural Scott County or in Oak Ridge, I love my job. I love representing them. I said when I was a lawyer, and I was a very successful lawyer, that I chose my clients wisely. If you represent good clients as a lawyer, you win more cases. If you represent great people, and I represent great people in Chattanooga and Hamilton County and throughout the 3rd District, you can do a really good job and be a star in Congress. I attribute my success up here on the Hill and my good reputation to the great people I represent back at home. Time and time again, you impress me. whether it's in Hamilton County, again, any of my 11 counties, the people are great, your values are great, you're moving our country forward in a way that I can take you all as a shining example and hold you up to the rest of the nation and say, this is what we're doing in the great state of Tennessee and why. And time again, I'm right.
What was your first job and what lesson did you learn that you still use today?
Wow. My first job was probably working for an art firm, packaging posters. I'm going to date myself now. I'm 58. This was in the late 70s, mid to late 70s. And I got to go work for an art firm. And I learned an awful lot because I got a great appreciation for the arts. As you know, in Congress, I'm a strong advocate for the humanities. I write, that is my gift. I've just written 2 novels. I'm working on a 3rd one. I love the flexibility of fiction. I have a lot of friends who write nonfiction and they're great at it, but I prefer fiction. But the arts are so important, music, but all of the arts and all the humanities. Having said that, I learned a lot. I learned responsibility. I got a nickel for every cutout I did. These were cardboard cutouts that I would put at the end of tubes. So there were 2 ends of tubes, so I got a dime a piece, and I was glad to get that. But I knew the harder I worked and the more of those I cut out, the more money I would make. So I learned a great appreciation for the arts. This was the era where people were putting posters on their wall. Every once in a while, I'll walk into a retro office and I'm happy, and I'll see an old poster from the late 70s or early 80s when museums used to have a show or something. They would have a poster, whether it was Degas or Monet and that type thing. It was great. So I learned respect and appreciation for the free enterprise system. I always had an appreciation for hard work. My second job was scrubbing floors at McDonald's for $2.10 an hour. Again, a great appreciation for hard work. I was 110 pounds then. I'm about 150 now by comparison, but I remember carrying that wash bucket of dirty water, sloshing around and getting it all over myself and just going home dead tired. But an appreciation for hard work, for seeing people raise themselves up. I was the first person in my family to get to go to college, made the most of it. So I learned respect for the free enterprise system, admiration for the free enterprise system, great respect for capitalism. I'm all in on capitalism and I am against socialism.
Well, my first job was in one of your districts in Campbell County, where my family, my mom still lives today.
I love Campbell County. Are you from Fallon or Jacksboro?
Well, I'm from Jellicoe. So
you're from Jellicoe. Well,
yeah.
You know, I feel sorry for the people in Jellicoe for one big reason. Jellicoe, by the way, is up on the Kentucky line, but it's the only part of Campbell County I don't represent.
Really? I grew up in Haversham, so no one knows where that is. It's near Stinking Creek. So
I know where Stinking Creek is. That's right. I know how Stinking Creek got its name. But Campbell County is 2 of my counties. Bradley and Campbell are split, and it's 80-20. I've got the lower part of Campbell, and I've got the lower part of Bradley. By the way, for our listeners, there's going to be a great redistricting. It happens every 10 years. Our state legislature does that, so we'll see what happens then. But I love Campbell County. It's a great place, and Jellicoe is a wonderful place.
Well, you certainly, my mother lives in Jacksboro, so you certainly.
There you go.
So one last question. We want to be mindful of your time. If you could recommend one book for our members to add to their bookshelf, what would it be?
Well, on the fiction side, I'm a huge fan of Fitzgerald. I've always loved F. Scott Fitzgerald. So my favorite fiction work is The Great Gatsby. And I just think that's an outstanding book. But I do enjoy some of Hemingway's works as well. But now we have my works out there, so I don't know how they're going to.
I was waiting on that.
Get them published, we'll get them out there. Mine are political fiction and historical fiction, and quite good. It weaves in my political science, history background, and what I do now. So I've enjoyed that. Gosh, on the nonfiction side, I'm really a strong believer in reading political treatises. So I won't pick one, but I was privileged to be able to be schooled in the classics. So reading Plato and reading Aristotle and going back and saying, well, how did these ancient Greek philosophers come up with ideas about city-states? And then reading Roman historians, and then going up through The Wealth of Nations is a very good book as well. Reading books about what people think the body politic ought to look like, how it should function, and the like. And I'll say this, take out the United States Constitution sometime and read it. What really hurts me is when I go into a school, and I love to be with the school children, whether they're in elementary school, middle school, high school, or college, and just talk about American government, not Republican or Democratic government, but just American government. Forget the partisan politics and just talk about the sheer academics of things. It concerns me when so many young people have never taken the time to read the United States Constitution. It's an easy read, and you can actually read the Constitution with the original Bill of Rights and then all of the amendments, some of which have been repealed, like prohibition and things like that. Just going through and reading that and weaving that in to the entire document. Because some people are shocked to believe that there was a time in this country where we did not popularly elect senators, that they were appointed from the legislative bodies. We amended our Constitution to have them do that. So I think a great read is the United States Constitution, but again, I make that strict delineation between fiction and nonfiction.
Well, we appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for serving all of your 11 districts, and we look forward to chatting with you again really soon.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you. I'm a strong supporter of the Chamber of Commerce, and wherever your listeners fall politically, I still do love my job. I love representing my 700,000+ constituents in East Tennessee. And anytime you want to give us a call, please do. I'm always here to listen, to learn, and continue to do a good job for you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. And great job, Sharon. Now, I'd like to introduce you to Scott Jennings. Scott is a nationally renowned columnist, CNN contributor, former special assistant to George W. Bush, and confidant to Republican leader Mitch McConnell. Justin Furrow, our public policy chair, is going to lead you in this conversation now.
Well, I want to thank our elected officials for being with us for the Chamber's Federal Focus today. I am Justin Furrow. I'm the chair of the Public Policy Committee at the Chamber. And in addition to our elected officials, I want to thank our presenting sponsor, EPB of Chattanooga. We are excited now to bring our keynote speaker, Scott Jennings. Scott's bio is lengthy. I won't attempt to read it all. He's been involved in a number of presidential campaigns, congressional campaigns, state house campaigns. He's the founder of Run Switch PR based out of Louisville. He was in the Bush White House for 2 or 3 years from 2005 to 2007. And but I think the best description I've seen of Scott in doing my research on him is that he's charming, he's fun, but my favorite, he's dressed prosperous dad casual in polo shirt and khakis, but he's also lethal. I think, Scott, you're in your lethal attire today, so welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Justin. And yeah, so a magazine writer wrote that about me a few years ago. It seems to recycle every now and again. People make fun of my dad casual polo. I remember the day we interviewed, though. I was wearing khakis and a polo shirt. That's absolutely a true story.
Hey, as a father, it is appropriate dad attire, so I appreciate that. So let's start. I think everybody probably wants to hear about your time in the White House. You were in the Bush White House beginning in 2005. So tell us a little bit about your role there and what you did.
Yeah, I was special assistant to President George W. Bush and served in the Office of Political Affairs, which was a bit of a catch-all office that managed the president's interactions with the Republican Party at large. We also managed the president's domestic travel and had a large hand in that. And I personally had a big role and spent a huge amount of my time on personnel. So in my job, I went to regular meetings in the Oval Office where we were deciding on appointments. Most appointments or most jobs in the federal government are not politically appointed, but the president has a few thousand political appointments, everything from cabinet secretaries to Supreme Court justices to other lower level officials and boards and commissions. And one of my jobs was to help the president find people who supported his agenda and find their way into federal service if they wanted to do that. So it was an interesting time, that right after the election in 2004, we had a big win. I was part of both of his campaigns. It was an honor to work in the White House, but then we ran into a lot of difficult issues. His attempt to reform Social Security, of course, didn't work. Iraq had huge problems. We had Hurricane Katrina, during that time. So we certainly lived through a lot of turbulence in that second term.
No doubt. So it's been about a decade and a half since you've been in the White House, which, guys, it seems like it was just yesterday. I'm sure it does for you as well. But how do you think Washington has changed since your time in the White House? How would you describe it as being different, or is it different?
Well, it's cliche to say this, but certainly it's more polarized. I mean, look, it's funny, during the Trump years, I feel like a lot of folks sort of forgot everything that happened before January 2017. It's like all of American history started when Trump took over. There was polarization in Washington when I was there. I mean, George W. Bush was a polarizing president. I mean, does any of this sound familiar? Guy wins an election, other party won't accept it, says that it was stolen. This all happened to Bush.
Yeah.
In his second term, in 2004, the voting machines were rigged. I mean, all this stuff has happened before. We had polarization, but in the policymaking process, there were bipartisan achievements during the Bush years on a number of different topics. Even when he was at his low point in terms of his personal popularity, he did have some bipartisan achievements that I think he and others who work there could be proud of. Today, it's harder. The idea of bipartisan achievement seems foreign, although hope springs eternal on something like infrastructure. But it just seems more difficult for the two parties to work together because of the fear of what your base will say if you're caught working with the other party. And so I think that's one issue. The other is social media. I was there just as these social platforms were being invented. And so we didn't have to deal with the immediacy of social media interactions, backlash, influence, whatever you want to call it. And so we were still very much operating in a traditional media environment. That's all, of course, changed now and is far different. So the communications landscape, I would say, overall is the biggest difference. And it, of course, has dramatically impacted how the presidency operates.
So you mentioned a couple of times bipartisan achievements. What do you think is the key to being able to work across the aisle and to achieve those bipartisan efforts, to be able to cooperate with the other side and still maintain your base? How have you seen that be effective, or what do you think the key to being able to do that is?
Well, number one, it requires some amount of good faith. And I think during the Trump years, candidly, there was very little good faith from the Democrats. During the Bush years, there wasn't that much good faith. And of course, during the Obama years, Democrats would argue there wasn't much good faith from the Republicans. And so you have to have a dollop of good faith in there. And then, at some point, there is a political calculation that goes on where people have to ask themselves, can we find a happy medium here between what we want and what they want, and will our people accept it? And do people expect us to work together on this? Sometimes they do, and when they do, it doesn't get all the great headlines that conflict generates. But I think the heightened tension coming out of the election in 2016, coming out of the election in 2020, has made those windows of good faith very difficult, and it's unfortunate. So right now, the best example of whether this can work or not is on the infrastructure. And you do have Republicans and Democrats in the Senate working together. But look who's leading the charge. Senator Rob Portman, who I revere and has worked with in the Bush White House, from Ohio. Well, he's not running for re-election. So the good faith is, in some cases, coming from people who don't really have anything to fear from the voters anymore. And so ultimately, I also think some of it is on the issue and the problem. And I think infrastructure has gotten to the point, and I know this is of interest to chamber audiences, where, you know, we have roads, bridges, highways, airports, and seaports that are literally falling apart. I mean, it's unbecoming of America, the world's greatest economy and the world's greatest democracy, to have some of the transportation issues that we have in this country. So, you know, sometimes the problems get to the point where, okay, we've hit critical mass. I actually think on drug issues, the drug epidemic, the Congress has, in a bipartisan way, actually passed quite a bit of funding for recovery of addiction crisis, you know, workforce development for people who are recovering from addiction, housing for people who are recovering from addiction. That was another topic where for a long time, everybody was looking around waiting for someone to do something, but it reached critical mass. And finally, both parties decided to work together on it. So sometimes it's unfortunate, I guess, that it takes so long for problems to fester to the point where something has to happen. But that's often the way Washington works. You know, when you can't wait another day, that's when they get on it.
Yeah, it's a good point. So you mentioned infrastructure and how it affects the business community. Of course, we know that all too well at the chamber. But as you look across the landscape, you know, what are some other key issues that you see facing the business community that our members should be concerned about? Maybe some that they're obviously aware of, and maybe some that they aren't quite thinking about.
Well, I'll give you one policy issue and then sort of one long-term political issue. On the policy side, at the same time, I think a lot of chambers are cheering on and businesses are cheering on the infrastructure package in the hopes that that gets done. You know, the Democrats who are in control of Congress are pushing forward with a $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation package, which is going to contain fairly massive tax increases on businesses. One of the greatest policy achievements of the Trump years was the 2017 tax cut, and they're looking to roll back some of those tax cuts, and that'll have a big impact on businesses. One other policy issue, I said one, I'll give you two, is just the influence of all the direct payments from the federal government to people and how that impacts our labor market. I'm sure in Tennessee, like in Kentucky and everywhere else I go, I run into business people all the time who say, you know, I'm paying a good wage, I'm offering hiring bonuses, I've got great health care, I'm doing everything I can think of, and I can't get people to show up for work. Heck, I can't even get people to show up for the interviews they sign up for. I hear that every single day. Well, just this last week, the Biden administration, you know, touted its these new direct payments, the biggest entitlement program since Social Security to families that have children. Well, if you don't think that's going to have an impact on people working, just like the unemployment enhancement did, I got news for you. So I think that's a long-term policy question for businesses, is dealing with a shrinking labor pool, and that's manifesting itself in all sorts of ugly ways. On the political front, you know, if I were advising businesses right now, I think one of the biggest dangers in the policy space comes from the political implications of a rising anti-corporate tide within the Republican Party. You know, we've seen the rise of populism, and certainly Republicans over the past, you know, several decades have been basically aligned, you know, with the free market and business interests. But lately, we have seen this rise of populism and in some cases the rise of, I think, anti-corporate thinking out of some pretty prominent Republican leaders. And if that continues and you were to combine their views with the true anti-corporate views of a lot of the leading Democrats, you could see where you could get policy alignment out of both parties in ways that would really dramatically and negatively impact businesses in the free market. So I think over the long haul, one of the things the business community has to do is tamp down this anti-corporate or anti-business sentiment that has always, I think, existed on the left, but is now starting to pop up and manifest itself on the right.
So on the topic of the infrastructure plan, the latest I heard is the price tag is $3.5 trillion. We know in response to the pandemic that Congress spent several $1 trillion last year, from the CARES Act to the American Rescue Plan. You know, what is the political fallout, if any, from this type of what I believe is pretty massive spending when we're throwing around several trillion with a T dollars?
Yeah, $6 trillion last year, $1.5 trillion for infrastructure, and $3.5 trillion for budget reconciliation. I mean, these are it's easy to say they're mind-boggling amounts, but they're amounts of money that none of us can really. I mean, it's an amount of money that doesn't mean anything it doesn't mean anything to me. You know, I mean, trillion, 3.5 trillion, 5 trillion, 6. I mean, these amounts of money are mind-boggling. And now we have such a federal debt that, you know, I mean, how many times we heard people argue, oh, the debt's going to crush us, it's going to crush us. And a lot of people say, well, I don't know, it doesn't seem like it doesn't affect someone like me. So on the one hand, folks are going along with it because it doesn't seem to affect them. On the other hand, we're about to spend, if they do all this, overall, because of COVID, the federal government will have spent more money on COVID recovery than it spent, you know, in real dollars to win World War II. I mean, think about that for a second. I mean, that's sort of a crazy amount of money. Yeah. The real world implications are already here. It's inflation. You know, we have inflation at the pump. We have inflation at the grocery store. We have inflation in building materials. We have inflation across the board. There was just a key inflation indicator that came out a couple of days ago showing, you know, this sustained inflation. And there's some disagreement among economists whether it's going to last forever or be a short-lived thing. But inflation is a real issue for businesses who need to buy things, for consumers who want to buy things. And even if you got a raise, or even if you got one of these payments from the federal government, if you're paying more, then it doesn't seem like you got a raise or a payment at all. And what will happen? The people getting the payments will clamor for more, saying, well, it's not enough because things cost too much. That's right. And then the policymakers in Washington will say, well, it's, you know, we got to go back to the well here. It's this never-ending death spiral, I think, of inflation, and it's already started. And so to me, that is the most real world problem we have is, are we going to be able to get inflation under control when right now Washington is controlled by people who want to keep spending and don't seem to really fear the implications of this kind of money printing, this kind of borrowing, and this sort of national debt and deficit.
Death spiral, that's a pretty dramatic description, although I think it's apt. So, you know, obviously this has an impact on the business community. And as the Chamber, we're an organization of 2,000 plus member businesses. How can, in your opinion, the business community better advocate for itself or be a better partner with government at all levels? I mean, you've been in various levels of government in your career. How can the business community better interact and maybe have its voice heard other than a 30-second soundbite or a stereotypical position?
Well, I think one thing the business community, and this doesn't have as much to do with direct relationships as it does with overall PR, needs to consider is how are we viewed right now by policymakers? I think it's pretty easy to see how we're viewed, you know, by the Democrats, by the American left. But as I mentioned earlier, taking stock of the business community's image in the American right is vital right now because I really think it's suffering. I think small businesses and the concept of a small business still retains institutional support from the American people. I think people trust small businesses, but larger businesses, big corporations, I mean, you know, let's be honest, folks who employ a lot of people, they're suffering right now. And that is going to have policy impact down the road if both parties decide we hate big business. I mean, who knows what bad things can happen when the two political parties were, you know, if they got together on deciding they wanted to punish somebody they didn't like. I mean, bad things could happen. I think at a micro level, it's vital for chambers to be engaged. And I also think it's vital for chambers, frankly, to take stock of who's with them and who's against them. I mean, I know chambers often, you know, want to try to make relationships on both sides of the aisle, but I really do think it's important that the chambers and the business community and individual business owners take stock of, okay, we lent you our support. We gave you an award. We gave you a good rating. You know, we said nice things about you in a press release. Whatever you did, what did they do with that? What did they do after that? Because I think a lot of people love to get adulation and they want to get the kudos from the chamber, but they don't want there to be any consequences for a bad voting record. And so I think the people who consistently vote with you often look to the chamber to try to be very clear and make very clear lines of demarcation about who's with businesses in the free market and who's against it. And so one of the ways I think to strengthen those relationships is to really have clear lines about what we expect. If we give you our support, what do we expect you to do? And it's really not all that complicated. We expect you to enact policies that help us put more people to work, and we expect you not to enact policies that make it harder for us to put people to work. And it's oftentimes I think politicians want to have it both ways. I want my chamber award, but I also want to be able to vote and do things that hurt a business. And I think chambers really need to take stock of that and publicize it.
Well stated. So let's switch to the 2020 election. You know, one of the surprises coming out of that election, one of the surprises was the Georgia runoffs and flipping those seats from Republican to Democrat. So now we know we have a new majority leader, Senator Schumer, but it's been reported he has a very close relationship with Senator McConnell. Can you tell us a little bit more about how they interact or their relationship? Maybe is it as chummy as it seems, or is it more chummy than it seems, or how would you describe it?
I wouldn't describe it as chummy, and I'll just say I don't speak for Mitch McConnell. I'm around him quite a bit, and I listen very carefully to the things he says. I certainly wouldn't describe it as chummy. I think the one area of alignment or the one similarity between them is that they're both, and I say this with a lot of respect, they're both political animals. You know, they're both, I think, in your job as conference, head, it's a lot of political spear catching and a lot of political maneuvering. And I think Schumer's a liberal and I think McConnell's a conservative, but I don't think either is as driven as much by their ideology as they are driven by their desire to win races and to control the chamber. Because even though in the Senate you need 60 votes to do most things, whoever the majority leader is controls the flow of legislation to the floor. And that of course makes a huge difference. And as McConnell says often, it's better to be offensive coordinator than defensive coordinator. So I think the big similarity for them both is that neither is truly, an ideological crusader. I think they both have their principles and their values, but both are constantly trying to make decisions that would make it more likely for them to have that majority. Certainly Schumer was doing that in the run up to the Georgia runoffs that you mentioned. McConnell pulled out all the stops as well. So that occupies, I think, a lot of their time. And there are things on which they've had some agreement in the past, and certainly there will be more. But this whole infrastructure reconciliation dance is a good example, though, of just how difficult it is. On the one hand, you've got the parties trying to work together on infrastructure, and at the same time, Democrats are doing a go it alone strategy on doing $3.5 trillion in spending, tax increases, et cetera, et cetera. And so it makes it hard, and everything is colored by just who's going to control it. And as you mentioned, the Georgia runoffs went against the Republicans, and it made the Senate 50-50. So it's not like, even though Democrats are nominally in control, they can't, they don't have any room for error here. And I think that also makes Schumer's position, frankly, pretty shaky.
Great segue into my next question, which relates to the filibuster. We do have a 50-50 Senate. We understand, I think, because of the media, the topic of reconciliation and the topic of how we typically need 60 senators to vote for something. But with the fact that it's 50-50, we now have the filibuster really coming into focus. Talk a little bit about that and its role in the Senate and how you see the future of the filibuster. I mean, are we going to vote to end the filibuster or not? Give us a little bit of your perspective on that.
Well, it seems pretty safe and secure. Well, it seems safe. I don't know how secure. It seems safe for the moment because Republicans don't want to get rid of it. And a couple of Democrats, Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, have said flatly they don't want to get rid of it. My suspicion is several more Democrats also want to preserve it, but they like to let Manchin and Sinema catch all the spears from the progressive groups on this. So as long as that dynamic exists, it's not going anywhere. And that's a good thing because it preserves the prospect of bipartisanship. The filibuster rule essentially means you need 60 out of 100 to do most anything in the Senate. And so getting 60 in a 50-50 Senate, by definition, means you got some people from both parties to buy in. I think that has a moderating influence on legislation. If you take it away, the Senate essentially just becomes the House. And that's not the way the system was designed. George Washington described the House as the sloshing, hot teacup, and the Senate is the saucer that catches the liquid and cools it off. So I think you do want the chambers to operate differently so that you don't get the same political dynamics in each. There's also something to be said about protecting the rights of minority voices in a political organization. And so right now, if you take away the filibuster, you would tell 75 million Americans who just voted Republican in the last election, you literally have no voice in policymaking. And I don't think that would be good. The filibuster is kind of the last rule that gives the minority party in our system any voice and gives some sort of institutional pressure to trying to achieve bipartisanship. if you want to keep people engaged in the political process, you need to give them something, in my opinion, to hang their hat on. And in an election like this one, where Republicans lost the White House, lost the House barely, and then wound up at a 50-50 Senate, giving them some kind of rule where they could have some influence, on moderating the policy is a good thing. And fortunately, Republicans and a couple of Democrats are going to preserve it. Long term, a lot of analysts think it's going to go away someday. I hope that it doesn't, but long term, it's probably on shaky ground. In the immediate term, it looks safe to me. Thank goodness.
Yeah, thank goodness. So you're a public relations professional. You spend a lot of time commenting on the various news networks, and we've seen throughout the last several years an assault on the media, whether that's fair or not. What's your take on the state of mainstream media? And you mentioned social media earlier, and the gaining of influence of social media. Is one going to replace the other? Is mainstream here to say? Give us your perspective on that.
Sure, and thank you for bringing up my hobby, being on TV. I do spend a fair amount of time on CNN, and I've been with the network now for just over 4 years. So it's been a kind of a wild ride to do cable TV all during the Trump years, and through an election, through a pandemic, and now as Biden is getting off the ground. I have to say, CNN obviously gets attacked a lot by Republicans. Trump hated them, but I've been on a lot. They've never moderated what I say. They've never told me what to say. I get to go on and give my authentic opinion. And I'm grateful for the platform to do that. But I get asked a lot, and this is a segue into my larger point by my Republican friends. Why do you go on CNN? Why do that? Why don't you go on Fox? And I always say, well, don't we want to have conservative viewpoints across the media spectrum? Why do we want to segregate ourselves into one thing? But when you think about that kind of commentary, it is a commentary on the larger media space where essentially we've all gone to our corners, and technology has made it possible for us to curate only what we want to hear. We're all looking for confirmation bias. And so if I believe Donald Trump is great and everything he does is perfect and true, then I can curate TV channels, social networks, a Twitter feed, whatever, my Google News feed. I can curate a life, a reality that confirms what I want to believe. If I believe the opposite, that Trump is terrible and Republicans are awful, I can also curate that. And too many of us, in my opinion, are not exposed to other viewpoints. And that's one of the reasons I really value my spot on CNN, is that, I think a lot of Democrats watch it, obviously, and not as many Republicans, but I think the people watching CNN should be treated to a fair debate on an issue. I think everybody consuming political and public policy information should be subjected to some kind of fair debate. But you mentioned social media. One of the impacts it's had on our media consumption is that it's led to us being able to put ourselves in these bubbles, only talk to people who believe what we believe, only get information from people who line up with us 100%. And I would just submit, as a voracious consumer of news and information, that it helps me understand our world, and it helps me understand my own personal views, and it strengthens my ability to argue my views if I subject myself to people who don't agree or who have different ideas about what we should be doing. I think it's had a nasty effect on our politics, frankly. And if you can't listen to the other party, consume what they're saying, and then debate them and try to win those policy arguments, it makes you weaker, I think, inside of a political system that demands robust debate. And what happens? If you don't have the two parties actually debating each other on issues, well, pretty soon they decide, well, we don't even really need to have a platform at all, because if we're not going to be debating, do we really need to put out what we believe in? Well, what did the Republicans do last year? They literally didn't have a platform. It was an abomination that we didn't have a platform. And so I'm worried about a total post-policy world where the media consumption technology that we have puts us all in our bubbles, puts us all in our corners. We all agree on everything, so there's no reason to debate each other. And it really sort of we no longer exercise those policy muscles. We no longer exercise formulating policy, debating policy, winning the debate. If you're not exercising those muscles, they atrophy. And I think it'll have a hugely negative impact on our two-party system and frankly, on our body politic, period. You're going to wind up with more elections where we have two personalities fighting each other instead of two competing policy visions.
How, in your opinion, do we get the citizenry engaged or willing to be engaged in more than just a 140 character tweet or a 30-second soundbite? I mean, I hear what you're saying on policy platform, and I'm with you on all fours there. But you know, those who are not voracious consumers of policy and information, how do we get them to listen to more than just the 30-second commercial or read more than just the Facebook newsfeed?
Well, I don't know that you ever will achieve total movement on that. I mean, you know, we have a big country. There's a lot of people here. You know, a huge chunk of the country doesn't vote. So, you know, the idea that if you don't vote, that you're going to turn into some policy wonk overnight, I think is not real. Then you have a group of people who only vote in presidential elections, not in midterms. Then you have people who vote in virtually every election. And so you're always going to have, I think, cohorts of engagement. And, you know, by some metrics, democracy is actually pretty healthy in terms of participation. We had massive turnout in 2020. We had massive turnout in 2018. A lot of people who've never voted came out to vote for both Trump and Biden. That is a good thing because we took people who were totally disengaged and got some engagement out of them. I think the question is, how do we keep them engaged? And how do we keep them engaged in a way that wants them to be involved in the civic life of their communities more than once every 4 years? And I think ultimately, you know, you all are community leaders in your town. I'm engaged in the civic life of my town, and the best politics is local politics, and the best engagement is local engagement. And so where I actually think we want to grow is getting people who are now politically interested to be more interested in their town, to be more interested in their school board, to be more interested in their local chamber, whatever, instead of just being interested once every 4 years. I think one of the impacts of the Trump years is that we truly saw the federalization of everything. So even races for state representative or city council somewhere sort of turned on, well, are you for or against Trump?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, is it relevant? I mean, is it really relevant, you know, whether the nonpartisan local city council race featured people who were for or against Trump? I might argue that it's not relevant. And so I think that we need to teach people who are now interested in our politics that federal issues are federal, local issues are local, they're different, but there's a reason for you to always be in your local town square. And one other just brief aside on this point. I think the people who are new to politics and the people who are voting for the first time, and a lot of people now donating to campaigns for the first time, we got a lot of new donors in the realm. I think we need to beat back this whole idea that if you don't agree with me, you shouldn't be allowed to speak. I appear on CNN a lot, and one of the biggest comments I get on Twitter and other realms is, why does CNN allow you on their network? Why are you allowed to speak? And I think there is a rising tide of authoritarianism in our politics where we want to make people who don't agree with us go away, take away their voice, drive them out of the town square. And I think it would be awful if all these new voters and all these new donors and all these new politically active people were driven away by folks in the other party. And I don't cast aspersions on one or the other, but I think it would be awful if the other side drove their opponents out, no matter where they are and what side you're on. So I think robust debate and participation is vital. We have to resist, I think, this rising tide of authoritarianism that starts with taking away people's speech and essentially banishing them from the public square. There's a lot of debate going on right now with tech companies on this, and who's allowed to talk, what are you allowed to post, what is the role of censorship in all this, and these are vital debates for us because I think it's going to have an impact on overall political engagement in the future.
So switching from the media, you know, a recent trend in presidential administrations has been the use of executive orders to, some would say, circumvent the ordinary legislative process. What are your thoughts on this? And is this a new reality, or is it here to stay, or is there some way that Congress can reassert its original power?
Well, it's both a new and an old reality. I think if you look at every presidential administration in the modern era, executive authority has increased with each one. You know, it certainly went up from Clinton to Bush. It went up from Bush to Obama. It went up from Obama to Trump. It's going up from Trump to Biden. Each one takes a little more space, a little more ground. And it's not new. It's been happening for a very, very long time. And if you look at the overall political situation in our country, it makes sense, right? Because people hold Congress in such low esteem. You know, the congressional job approval is always much, much lower than presidential job approval. So if you ask the average person, well, who do you trust to do something, the president or Congress? Well, most of the time, the president's going to win that question. And so as a political matter, there's never any backlash against this because the president's always more popular than the Congress. So I don't know that you're ever going to have meaningful rollbacks here. I don't think it's what the founders intended to have such a strong executive, but it is certainly what's developed. Sometimes it's helpful. I think on foreign policy, it's helpful for our country to speak with one unified voice. But on domestic policy, when the Congress can't agree on something, well, there's a reason they couldn't agree. And maybe it's not time to do anything at all. Maybe it's time to see how this debate develops. And when the executive steps in to impose his will on the policymaking process, it does circumvent the public debate that can often lead, I think, to better policy outcomes. And so it is concerning, but it's not new. It certainly looks to me like Biden is going to continue the trend of executive branch authority and trying to expand that. And I suspect the next president will want to do that as well. This won't change, by the way, until you actually have a president that takes office and says, you know, I've sort of analyzed all of the authority I have and all the things I could do, and I'm just going to not do it. I'm gonna cede this back to the Congress. Now, the idea that someone gets elected president and says, I'm going to relinquish my power, you know how far-fetched that sounds. It has happened on little issues here and there. During the Bush years, at the end of his administration, he didn't do as many pardons as Clinton had, and he made all of his pardons run through a political process. A formal non-political process at DOJ. And so he did sort of cede back, at least on that one area, I think some of the pardon authority. But then I think Obama sort of took it right back and did some political pardons. Trump certainly did political pardons at the end of his administration. So even when you have little dips in presidential power, you know, they often come right back. The biggest debate we're having over this right now is the War Powers Act. Congress gave Bush authority to invade Iraq way back when. That is still in existence, and presidents since then have used it to authorize all sorts of military action. And so that debate is certainly happening right now in Washington about whether the president on a 20-year-old war powers authorization, should they have unilateral decision-making authority to send us into new military conflict. And there's a lot of strong opinions that sometimes aren't line up directly with the parties. You've got Republican hawks and Democrat hawks who like it, and you've got Republican isolationists and Democrat isolationists who don't like it. So that one's not a clean partisan break.
So putting on your political forecasting hat, look into your crystal ball and tell us what happens in 22 and 24.
I think the Republicans have a great chance to take back the House in 22. You know, historically, they should take it back. The elections in 20 were much closer in the House than people thought they would be. And I think through some of the redrawing of the lines, through redistricting, you're going to see some improvements for the Republican landscape. So all that plus, there's going to be some backlash against some of the Biden policies and some of what's going on in the country. I think the House is the Republicans to lose. I don't know how big the majority will be, but I certainly predict right now that the Republicans will control it. The Senate is dicier. The map is dicier. There's a lot of holes out there for Republicans right now. Some places where they should be on offense against Democrats, they're struggling to find candidates. And then they have a few incumbent retention issues, such as Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, maybe even North Carolina, that are problems. So I think I would put the Senate at a toss-up right now, but I would just say the Republicans are in a far better position to take back the majority in the House than they are in the Senate. Whether they take back one or both chambers, Republicans then will spend the next 2 years stymieing the Biden agenda, and that will, of course, kick off the presidential campaign and lead us right to 2024.
So you caused a bit of a media stir a little bit ago with a question that you asked Senator McConnell when you asked him what Democrat president he would like to be stranded on an island with, and he picked President Biden. So my question for you is, other than President Bush, who I know you have an affinity for, what president would you like to work for?
I'm going to say Teddy Roosevelt. He's sort of a personal hero, more liberal and progressive than I am. But I just love the idea of him as the swashbuckling American adventurer, visionary, thinking about what I'm doing today and the legacy of that over 50, 100, 200 years, really looking down the road. And he just seemed like a hell of a guy to me. So I'm a big Teddy Roosevelt buff. I'll give you three others that I think were great. I think in his own way, he was a one-termer, but Taft from Cincinnati was a really conservative president. And he actually stood up to Teddy Roosevelt. He got elected on Roosevelt's endorsement and then became far more conservative than Roosevelt, which caused Roosevelt to get back into the arena. But I think Taft was a great American and a great man and a great public servant. I mean, obviously working for Ronald Reagan, if you're a conservative, would have been a huge thing. And I think Eisenhower is kind of an overlooked presidency. It was kind of the last presidency before the modern presidential era, right before JFK sort of transformed it into more of a celebrity office. But I think if you look on Eisenhower's 8 years, some of the things he did, the projections that he made, the warnings that he gave us, and the way he handled himself and the way he handled Washington, very, very commendable. And I loved Brett Baer actually has a great book on Eisenhower that if you haven't read much about it, I would recommend. So in that order, I'll take Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, Reagan, and Ike. And if you give me any of those, I've been a happy man.
I like it. So give us your favorite memory or favorite story from your time in the White House.
Well, I have many. Certainly flying on Air Force One for the first time was a huge thrill because there's a phone. In fact, at your chair, there's two phones. There's a white one and a red one. And I didn't know this, but the red one is for if you need to make a secure call. And the white one is if you're just jacking around. And so first time I was ever on Air Force One, I wanted to call my dad. And I didn't know the difference in the phone. So I picked up the red phone. And of course, you don't dial the number, somebody from the Air Force does. And I picked up the red phone and the guy immediately says, "Mr. Jennings, do you really need to make a secure call?" And I said, "No, I don't." Hung it up, picked up the white phone, same guy on the other end. "Okay, and now who do you want to call?" And so that was a kind of a funny memory of my first trip on Air Force One. I have a lot of great memories of being in the White House, of interacting with my colleagues, of being in the Oval Office. I got to go over there fairly frequently for meetings and briefings with the president. I remember a conversation I had once with Andy Card, who was the chief of staff that swore me in. A little known fact, when you're a commissioned officer in the White House, you actually get sworn in like you're taking office, and you take the oath that the president takes. And so it really hits home just how impactful your job is and what your responsibilities are to the country and the Constitution. But Andy Card once told me, I asked him, I'm like, how do you know when it's time to leave? And he said, the minute you walk through these doors every morning and you don't look up for a second and you're not in awe of this place, that's when it's time to leave. And Andy is somebody I really look up to. And I carried that with me every day to think about, just to really think about like what it means to step through the doors. Very few people ever get to work here, especially people from Dawson Springs, Kentucky. I'm from a little town in Western Kentucky, 30 people in my high school graduating class. I mean, these jobs when you're growing up, they don't seem like they're meant for you. I'm the son of a garbage man, they don't seem like they're meant for you. And so walking through those doors every day and knowing that I carry the people of Dawson Springs with me, and there's little towns all over Tennessee, just like Dawson Springs, knowing I carried them with me and thinking about what that meant, it's a good memory for me because, often folks like us don't make it to the White House. And so that's a good memory. There were a lot of days that seemed bad at the moment, but ultimately were character building. I was subpoenaed to testify before Congress and it seemed crappy in the moment, but it was a character building thing. So it's hard to be unhappy about anything you did when you're getting to serve the president. But overall, my service to George W. Bush, I'm enormously proud of what we accomplished. I'm really proud of President Bush being an honest man. I think, in our politics today, there's a lot of dishonesty. Let's be honest about dishonesty. A lot of dishonesty. Everybody engages in it. I hate it. And I always thought George W. Bush always took the high road on being honest and straightforward and plain spoken. And those are good memories as well. So I'm very proud of, it's interesting. He's sort of fallen out of favor with a lot of Republicans over the years. But his integrity, his character, his honesty, even when we were at our low point in job approval, I don't think anyone ever doubted what was in his heart. He was trying to do the right thing. And so personal memory for me is just knowing going in to serve a president every day that was doing it for the right reasons, even if he knew even if he knew it was going to be politically detrimental, he was going to do what he thought was right. And so I guess if I had any lessons to take away from it all, is I wish there were a few more people in politics that I thought were doing it for the right reasons and not for the political reasons, although sometimes those are in alignment, but not always.
Scott, that's a great perspective. You mentioned the book on Eisenhower a few moments ago. I'd like to close with what's a softball, but I think it's important, right? Give us your recommendation of a book that we should add to our bookshelves.
I'm going to give you a completely non-political answer because this year I have actually engaged in an activity that has fundamentally changed my life and my perspective on my health. And that is called intermittent fasting. I've struggled with my weight. If you go back and Google me and you see my time in the White House, you see a 275 pound, 280 pound guy. I've yo-yoed for years. Like a lot of people, I've tried everything. I worried about my weight. I have history of diabetes in my family and heart disease, and it's like figuratively and literally weighed me down for most of my adult life. And I read this book by a doctor named Jason Fung called The Obesity Code. He's also written some other books, but it really I finally became educated on why I was heavy. And I never understood the relationship between my health, what I was eating, when I was eating it. And for a lot of professionals, it's easy for the social pressures to dictate your diet and to dictate all of that. And it really does have a fundamentally negative impact on your health. So if I had to give you one recommendation, pick up The Obesity Code, read it, understand it, and do what's right by your health. I've been on this journey for the last 6 months. I've lost about 60 pounds, but more than that, the mental clarity, the focus, the sense of personal accomplishment, the idea that I'm now in control of this and not the other way around. It's been huge for me. So Obesity Code, Dr. Jason Fung, that's my recommendation.
Awesome. Well, Scott, thank you so much. Thank you on behalf of the Chamber and all of our members for keynoting our federal focus. Appreciate everyone being in attendance today, and good luck, and thank you for being here.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate the time, Justin.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Great insights. Well, that wraps it up. I hope you enjoyed today's conversations from Neil Bradley, Senator Marsha Blackburn, Senator Bill Hagerty, Congressman Chuck Fleischmann, and our keynote, Scott Jennings. I hope you found today as insightful as I did, and we look forward to engaging you going forward as we continue to work with our delegation on issues that matter to the business community in Southeast Tennessee. Again, I'd like to thank our sponsors for today's event. Our presenting sponsor, EPB, our platinum sponsor, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee and Sandler Training, and our gold sponsors, the Chattanooga Airport, Food City, Chambliss, Lattimore Black, Morgan & Kane, Pinnacle, the Sasha Group, Truist, Unum, and Volkswagen. If there's any information you need, please don't hesitate to contact me at the Chamber, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks and have a great day.